Marcia Mount Shoop. I am a theologian, an author, a Presbyterian minister, and I'm a football coach's wife. I'm a mother. I'm a middle school cross-country coach. I need to throw that in there. And I do a lot of work in many different institutional contexts and non-institutional contexts around embodiment, race, and really healing from all sorts of wounds that come at the hands of abusive forms of power. Well, I grew up an athlete, and I grew up loving football. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky where the biggest thing going on was the football games, high school football games on Friday night, and the whole town was there. And so I've always loved football, but I think my status as a kind of fan of football changed when I married a football coach. I'm not a fan. I'm a coach's wife, and that is a very different ontological status than a football fan. When I met John, we were actually both studying religion in England at Oxford in a summer program. And we were both going to be entering our senior years in college, and we were really both discerning what we wanted to do. And both of us were thinking about the ministry, and both of us were really, really just very dedicated athletes. And so we were both thinking about coaching also. And so I really admired the way he made his decision, which was that when he looked back on his life, the people who had really impacted him the most hadn't been his minister. They were his coaches. Next to his parents, his coaches were the most formative people in his life. And so he really thought if he wanted to make a difference in young men's lives, that coaching was the best way to be in ministry. And I really admired that about him. And I think he admired about me that I really wanted to pursue ministry in the institutional church and in the academy. And so we kind of incorporate each other's passions in a way. So I didn't set out to kind of, yoke myself to the world of football, but I fell in love with a man who is passionate about the game. And I think when you look at our marriage, a feminist theologian married to a professional football coach, there's some places of tension there that are real. But for us, it has been a really generative, fruitful, life-giving, heart-making, heartbreaking reality that makes sense. And I think football has made us better people, both of us. Well, football is the quintessential community. It is a symphony of human performance. There aren't many other sports that are so, the people are just so tangled up with each other for it to be successful. And because of the intensity of the game, and let's just go on and put it out there, the violence of the game, there has to be a special sauce there. It's got to have people really, to have a successful football team, there have to be these really deep and profound connections that people have with each other. And I think that is what captured my husband's imagination. And as a young boy growing up in Pittsburgh, football in the 70s, the Steelers were it, And so for him, it was this aspiration of belonging and community and purpose and connection and relationship, brotherhood, And I think for me, coming alongside that as a woman and, really in a way being shut out of that. I mean, I don't have access to that as a female. I was on lots of sports teams and we were really close, but a cross-country team is different than a football team. But for me, I think that's what I also appreciate about what football is a space of connection and relationship and community and everybody doing their part that brings together people, all kinds of people. Big people, fast people, tall people, short people. Everybody kind of has their thing that they can contribute. For me, it kind of surfaces this ideal of community and shared purpose that really resonates with me. It really excites me. So for me, what's glorious is that, kind of watching that unfold, watching it work. And I think really this doesn't sound very glorious to a lot of people, but for both my husband and me, the biggest payoff of football is the people, the players, the young men that he's coached that we get to know and that are a part of our family and that our kids know, and they're just amazing people. And we wouldn't have those relationships if it weren't for football. As an offensive coordinator, that's really what my husband is all about, is about trying to invite this group of people into these, kind of anticipatory connections with each other. To be able to, place a ball at a certain, anticipate that you're going to be where you're supposed to be. Being able to pick up blocks or defenses or, different assignments and switch gears and call audibles and all the things, all the feel that they have to have. Those kind of adaptive skills, that kind of improvisational quality to it, those are, we'd all be better if we had more skills in that department. So I actually find it to be a very suggestive space. For me, it's not just X's and O's. It's about relationships and connection. It's kind of a crazy story. He was a Division III quarterback. He wasn't big enough to go any further after college, and so he decided, and as I said, he kind of discerned about what to do with his life, and he decided to go into coaching. He started at Dartmouth as a volunteer coach. He lived in a closet and didn't get paid and didn't even have a meal card. Literally kind of got a job in the little burger pit or whatever, so he could eat some French fries and a hamburger because they didn't pay him. His first assignment, the first game day, was that he couldn't come into the stadium and be on the sidelines unless he sold all the programs. So he sold them and got in there before the game started. He sold every program. And so he started in this kind of place where it was just like, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I really love it, so I'm going to give it a shot. He went from there to Vanderbilt University as a graduate assistant, and his first day there was told to change all the light bulbs in the building. That was one of his first jobs. So you can kind of pick up on there's a humiliating factor to starting out. There's a kind of weeding out of people, and, He didn't get a lot of sleep for a lot of years. But after the coaching staff at Vanderbilt changed, that was under Jerry DiNardo, he left and went to LSU. And John was finishing up his master's at Vanderbilt and done with his graduate assistantship, and the new coaching staff came in. And so he was just trying to get a job and make himself useful. And the new defensive coordinator was there, and so John helped him with playbooks and stuff like that for a couple weeks. And then that coach left abruptly to go to the Carolina Panthers, which was an expansion team. And he said, I don't normally leave after 2 weeks of taking a job, but I've got to go. This is a better job. There's an expansion team. You have really impressed me. I'm going to take your phone number. I'm going to give it to the new head coach of the Carolina Panthers, Dom Capers. And so a few days later, John was hired blind over the phone. He's 24 years old. Got in his truck and drove to Charlotte, North Carolina, and became one of the youngest coaches in the NFL ever. And pretty quickly moved up the ranks, became the quarterback's coach his second year there. We went to the playoffs. He had Pro Bowl quarterback Kerry Collins, coached him as a rookie and all through his first few years in Carolina. Then we went to the Chicago Bears, and he became the offensive coordinator after just part of a season there, and was the youngest coordinator at the time to ever call a play in the NFL. He spent the next several years, there at the Bears. Then we went to the Buccaneers. He coached there for a year with John Gruden. He was the quarterback's coach there. Then we went to the Oakland Raiders, and he was quarterback's coach. He spent some time as the offensive coordinator and also coached the tight ends. And after all those moves, we really kind of looked at each other and said, what is this all about? You went into this to mentor young men, and it just didn't feel like that was what he was really able to do in the NFL. And so he made a decision to leave the NFL and go to college football, and we went to the University of North Carolina. Had a great few years there, and then the NCAA investigation there started while we were there. And since then, we've been on a very steep learning curve about some of the things I write about in my book. Just kind of some of the distorted quality of college revenue sports. I don't know if I would use the word corruption. To me, that has connotations of cheating and, kind of, and there is that's going on. I would prefer to use the word distortion, because I feel like what is actually, that maybe the corruption stuff isn't even our biggest problem, the fact that they're cheaters or that people built the system or whatever. The problem is the system itself and the very architecture of the system. And that is what we learned the hard way at the University of North Carolina. I think for me, one of the core issues is racism and the ease with which we create systems that disadvantage black bodies. And I think college revenue sports is a system that disadvantages black bodies. I think money is also a core factor. Anytime you see so much wealth generated, there are going to be a lot of people trying to get in on that. And there are going to be a lot of people trying to create systems that help that wealth be concentrated in the hands of certain people. And in college revenue sports, the wealth is concentrated in the hands of white men. That's who benefits the most from the system. So for me, I think people like to look at the scandals, the cheating, I wish we could talk more about the system itself, the architecture of the way the whole thing is set up, from the kind of red herring of amateurism to our systems of higher education and our failure to accommodate and adapt to diverse communities and their needs, to the system of eligibility that is supposedly in place to say that we value academics, but actually creates this farcical system in which many athletes do not have space to learn about anything they care about or get an education that's going to be useful to them after college. So I prefer to look at a distorted system and not corruption, I guess. I think when you look at the absurdity of how much time, money, people power are spent on regulation, enforcement, punishment, it's a pretty bewildering system when you look at it. And I feel like the will is not really there to look at the architecture because it's working very well for some people. Very well. I think people don't realize the pressure cooker that these players are in. And for especially the players of color, this thin line they're constantly walking between being a commodity that everybody really cares about and wants to protect and fawn over, and a criminal. There's barely any space between those two things. And there's constant rhetoric to players about making good decisions, not messing up, and all this stuff. And they're young. These are 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old young men. So anybody that age is going to mess up sometimes. They're normal college students, they're figuring out who they are. But the cost of those missteps is annihilating, and it is criminalizing. And we saw that at University of North Carolina, how quickly players who had been adored and just celebrated, and how quickly they became thugs. You didn't belong here in the first place. You don't know how to act. You should have just been grateful to be here. Just how quickly that came off people's tongues. When just a few days before, they would have loved to just get that person's autograph or get a picture with them or see him walking across campus or whatever. That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of confusing messages about what your status in the community actually is based on. Who are you in this place? And people don't understand the stress of that. They think, oh, well, athletes they have all this special treatment and, they have this and that. And it's like, yeah, well, they have a provisional spot in this community and they know what is at stake. And not many people could live with that kind of stress and feel solid and at home in a place. Oh, well, there's all kinds. I mean, from John not getting jobs because of it to just the way certain issues, if we bring them up, are silenced, or we're told, for instance, when the unionization conversation started at Northwestern, the word came down that we were not to discuss that. We were not to mention that to players.
What was that union?
Players tried to unionize at Northwestern. The football team tried to unionize. And it went to the National Labor Relations Board, and they said that they should be able to unionize. And so then the whole, kind of status of amateurism is in play, because if they can unionize, that means they're employees. And so the NCAA appealed it. And basically what happened a few months ago was the National Labor Relations Board said, well, we're not going to rule on it. We're not going to say, because that might hurt football. So we're not saying they are or are not employees at this time. So they could be in the future. This could come back up, but we're not going to say that they can do it. So they kind of punted. So it's the kind of question of how players should have a voice, what kind of agency players have in the, kind of power situation in revenue sports, is one that we definitely get a lot of pushback about, that is not okay. We should not open up that conversation with players, but we still do. Well, we've got to start with gender. I think football is this kind of caricatured template of masculinity and femininity in American culture. Football is an American-born product. It's a kind of morphed version of rugby, which was a European phenomena, but it became Americanized very quickly and really militarized. It was a way for young men to kind of learn some of the same skills of courage and toughness and violence that they would have learned if they were at war. And our country wasn't at war at that time, and so football was a way to kind of create some of those same character traits and reiterate the proper way, masculinity was to be expressed. I think that what we see today is that kind of, habituation of masculinity it's on steroids. Now it's like, and the spectacle has built. There's a whole kind of architecture built around it now, in which male bodies are caricatured and habituated to certain behaviors, and female bodies are also in the picture, kind of on the margins, on the sidelines, highly sexualized, with kind of extreme bodies that and so there's almost like this. There can be almost like this cartoon-like character to how gender is performed in football. And I talk about in the book about how the conversation since the 70s has been around, with Title IX, has been around gender equity in sports, and how, football is really the behemoth that creates inequity in sports, because there's so many scholarships and they get more money, more resources, more facilities, and so how can we equalize things so women have the same opportunities? And that equity conversation is important, but for me, again, as a social theorist, as a theologian, the more interesting thing for me is how do we look at the way the performance of masculinity and femininity in football is or is not life-giving for both men and women. And what I argue in the book is that the kind of conformist and kind of very small space, the constrained space that we could say women have in the template of football, I think we could also say about men, that it's a very conformist system. And again, this comes from personal experience of watching young men in very formative periods of their lives having to hide certain parts of who they are, or, kind of having this kind of split personality where in football they're one thing, but really they're something else in the rest of their lives. Players who love art or or drama, or players whose sexuality isn't the accepted norm. Seeing how they struggle to really find a way to be themselves, and seeing how my husband has struggled too to just be himself in this business that really is asking for you to fall in line and be a good soldier and be, conform to this very, little box about what it means to be a man. So for me, the spectacle, when it comes to gender, I'd say it's created a distorted way of understanding gender, but it's also constrained real human beings from really being themselves in a way that could actually enhance the game. But instead it's, kind of seen as a hindrance or something to be corrected. I'm going to start with the players standing up and saying we will not play a game. We will not play unless the president resigns at Missouri. I happened to be at a conference about sports at Baylor University when that happened, and I had just done a panel presentation on race in sports with a colleague of mine, Dr. Emmett Gill, who is the national convener of the Student Athletes Human Rights Project. So we had just been together talking about all these issues when that happened. And we immediately, got in touch with each other and got the network together and immediately communicated with any player that we could get in touch with and told them they had our support. We wrote a letter immediately to the athletic director and to the head coach, just affirming that they had come out in support of the players. It was a really exciting few days for all of us that are involved in players' rights, because this is what has to happen for things to change. Players are the ones that are going to make the change. They don't understand the power that they have. And I think seeing them, I think what was most exciting and emotional for me was seeing them do it about something that wasn't just about their interest. It was about racism. And I feel like the kind of entitled athlete moniker is something it's so easy for people to feel like, any talk about fair compensation for players or players' rights is just them whining. They've already got so much stuff, and this kind of entitled, you've always gotten things handed to you your whole life kind of narrative that people have about athletes. And so I really loved that the first time this happened, it wasn't about that at all. It was about a justice issue on their campus because they are students on that campus. And they have a right to stand up and say what they think and use whatever skills and resources they bring to the table to be involved in that conversation on their campus. They took up space in that conversation as students that have a particular kind of stake in that community. And anybody that wants to say that they're not revenue generators can't say that anymore. When you look at what happened, and once they stood up and said, we're not playing until this happens, and with less than 48 hours later, the president had resigned, that's pretty powerful. And it wasn't just the players. I mean, it was a build up to that point, and then the faculty joined in, and there was a walkout of faculty and things like that. But that was the tipping point. And so for all of us that are in the conversation around players' rights, it was an inspiring moment. And I think players all over the country, basketball and football players, have to look at that and start to think about what this could mean. From what I see, players that we know are very interested in, they are interested in larger issues of justice. For them, some of it's about their everyday lives and things like that, but it's also just about the larger questions, and they're curious about how to do that without being penalized or without being, without it costing them. And that was one of the things that was so great about Missouri, is when the Coach Pinkel came out and said, I support them. We're not going to have meetings today. We're not going to have, until this gets resolved, we won't be having football activities. That was pretty powerful. I think it was great what Michael Sam did. I think he stood up on behalf of a lot of gay football players. I think Michael Sam isn't the only one. And I think whenever you see a trailblazer and a pioneer, we just really have to celebrate the courage that takes to be the first one. And I watched with interest the kind of rhetoric around that with the draft, and is this going to cost him? And, well, he's not that good of a football player anyway. And, kind of the way people were in conversation around that. And, having been in the NFL for 12 years, I can tell you right now that didn't help him, That is a tough role to have in such a hyper-masculine business. But hopefully it was just, open the door and more players will feel like they can be themselves and say who they really are. I think the more players that do it, the more likely football is to change in a more life-giving direction for people, because there are lots of gay players. I mean, that's just statistically, the truth. But there is not a lot of space for that to be okay, especially in the NFL. I think when people hear redemption, they might want, it to be like, and then he became a millionaire or whatever. I think our redemption stories are more about people coming into their own. I think one of our all-time, favorite players that we've just loved being a part of his life and him being a part of our lives is Giovanni Bernard, who now plays for the Bengals. John and the other coaches too recruited him at UNC, and when he first came to UNC, he got injured pretty quickly and wasn't able to play, and was kind of discouraged about what was going to happen. And Gio had lived a life with a lot of challenges. His mother had died when he was young. He kind of had to grow up quick in a lot of ways, and he's a very grounded young man. So I always told him I wasn't worried about him, as a person. He was going to be fine. And it was just so great to see him flourish as a player, when he got better, and you never know how a knee's going to do after it's blown out. And he just came in and wowed everybody, and even after we left there, continued to set records, and now is doing the same thing for the Bengals. And I think that's one of those stories that makes everybody feel good. He's a good kid, good person, amazing story, amazing player, still just a really good guy. That's the kind of redemption story people love to hear, and we're so happy for him. But some of the ones that people never hear about are some of the ones that probably mean more to us. Like players who, really struggled at first in school and the academic part of things, and then finally caught their stride as a student and, really worked hard and got their degree, and then got a job that they loved after school, and, have healthy relationships in their lives. There's so many people like that out there, so many former players that, we still hear from, and we're just as happy for them as we are for Gio, that they figured out who they are, that they have good memories of their years playing football, that they grew as people, they grew as young men. I could list those guys and we'd be here all day. I wish that there was more value placed on those stories, instead of this kind of narrative that we put out there, that a success story is somebody who is a part of a winning program, sets records, and then becomes a very well-played NFL player. What about the stories of people who, made something of an opportunity and really grew as a person and became a constructive member of society? What about those stories? That was one of the things we really struggled with at UNC during the investigation, is all the negative stories that were out about the 18 young men who were a part of that investigation. Some of them for literally moving a sentence in a paper. So many of those young men were great people, very good students, very capable human beings that were going to do great things in their lives. They might not have been going to play NFL football. Some of them were, but how quickly they became criminalized and how they were labeled with, academic fraud and things like that that'll stick with them for the rest of their lives. And how poorly the media, the school, everybody did with kind of looking more deeply at who these young men were and are. I wish that I had fewer stories like that. And so for all those redemption stories and for all those happy endings, the ones that stick with me are the guys that haven't been able to pick up the pieces from all that. and aren't doing well and don't have a lot of options and really have bitterness and grief about all those years that they spent coming to nothing. I have to hold that together with the other stories. My consulting ministry is called Piecing Together, P-E-A-C-E, Piecing Together. And I found my way into that because I was having to piece together, P-I-E-C-E, my life in terms of my vocation and then my family status. Because of all of our moves and because of my husband's extreme work hours, I was doing all the parenting and we were having to move a lot. So the Piecing Together Ministries is really, it's a bringing together of a lot of different things that I value and that are important to me, and using those skills to cultivate healing around different woundedness. So I do work in different communities and institutions, from the church to the academy, around sexual violence, racism, sexism, abuse of power. And I do that by way of embodied practice. So there are a lot of consultants out there that talk about these issues and give people language to talk about racism, sexism, and abuse of power. But what I do is help people create space for people to experiment with different body practices that help to generate visceral data around different ways of using power in a community. So we don't just talk about it, we actually have an experience of it together, and then notice how that feels and what it might mean for how we could do things differently in the classroom or do things differently in our session meetings or whatever it is. But the body aspect of my work, I think, is what probably makes it unique and also what makes it more efficacious. So I do work in, for instance, a divinity school who wants to look at sexual violence and how the culture of that place does or doesn't kind of reify harmful patterns of power. Or I might do a retreat for people who feel marginalized by the church, so that we can, for a few days together, have an incarnational, Christ-centered community that isn't abusive, in which we can really be honest about our woundedness. Or I might, also a big part of my ministry is writing, and being in conversation across the world, across time zones and geography, with people who want to have an intentional conversation partner to help them unpack what's going on in their context, maybe in a place where I can't be physically, but I can be kind of in an advisory role through social media or through Skype or through other electronic means. So I do a lot of different things, but all centered on body healing and a critical look at power. One thing I might add is just, football. The book does talk a lot about football, but it's not just about football. It's about the redemptive quality of sports, and the kind of passion that sports elicits in us, but also it's about the kind of redemptive capacity of sports to create a space for us to practice some other ways of being together. And I guess I just want to make sure we highlight that, the vitality, the relationships, and the transformative capacity of sports are something that we need in our world today. And I guess my prayer for football is maybe more fervent than my prayer for other sports, that we might be able to tap into that capacity with some more urgency, instead of letting football kind of fall prey to some of our distorted ways of thinking about things. What if we let it help us change our ways? Because it's a kind of way to practice that. I don't see a lot of evidence of that happening, but I'm still hopeful that it can, mostly just because of the people that I know who are in it. And the other thing I would say is probably one of the most hopeful experiences I've had of late when it comes to sports is coaching 80 middle schoolers running cross country and seeing them figure out that they can keep going when it's hard. And I guess that's the most important thing sports can tell us is, yeah, this hurts. This is hard. Don't give up. So I'm not gonna give up on football anytime soon.